This is a good opportunity as any to get started. Welcome again, everybody. Let me mention one more time. You can turn your cameras on. That is awesome. You are at a Riveter event. For those who haven't been to Riveter events, this is a place where you can learn about the job market, learn about opportunities. And at all of our Riveter events, we talk about both the personal and professional of your career. So how do you balance the two? How do you find fulfillment in the two? And how you actually use each other as networking tools, use each other as self-educators to continue to move that forward. So we're going to do that a ton here. So I want to introduce our two speakers who are absolutely awesome, and I'm so proud that we have them on. Jess is a head of talent for multiple incredible venture capital funds currently at Code2, and Nikhil Singhal has been a product executive at startups and tech companies like Credit Karma, and he's currently a VP of product at Facebook. So we got two people who have been around tech, been around startups, hired hundreds of people between them, maybe 1,000, hired a whole lot of people and know what they're looking for and know how to get in. So Jess, why don't you introduce yourself? Thank you, Hillary, you are wonderful. Why don't you introduce yourself, tell us about you, tell us about what you do for work.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. Thrilled to be here. Like Adriel mentioned, my name is Jess. I now lead talent at Code2, which is a hedge fund that now runs a venture capital arm as well. So an investor across series stages and geographies focused on technology. I actually started my career at Capital One. So for those of you looking to transition from big companies to startups, I've done it myself and I get it, and have spent my time both across HR functions as well as in recruiting, and now work with all of our early stage teams on broad kind of org design and team building initiatives, as well as individual case-by-case recruiting. So glad to be here and learn more about all of you.
And Jess, just for some more context, you've worked at places like Benchmark, which is a really big VC fund, now at Code2. What are some of the notable names in tech or startups that you've helped place people at?
Yeah, absolutely. Have worked with teams like Uber, like Stitch Fix, for those of you who are familiar, earlier stage teams at their inception, obviously, but public companies include DoorDash, Snowflake, teams like that, recent IPO headlines. So
awesome, appreciate it. So we're going to learn a lot about from the recruiter's perspective. And now, Nikhil, why don't you introduce yourself as contact, current VP of product at Facebook, and also the writer of an awesome career newsletter for those in tech called The Skip. I just posted a link to that. I read it whenever it comes out. So I hope you guys sign up and enjoy that as well. Nikhil's a great writer. So Nikhil, tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Adriel. Pleasure joining all of you, and hope you had a nice holiday weekend as well. Yeah, kind of career-wise, my career is kind of in two chapters. I was I brought up in the Midwest, and I went to high school and elementary school in Kansas, and then came out to the Bay Area, where I went to school, and then I started my tech career. My first chapter was all in startups. So my first 12 years was in 4 startups. I joined one, I founded one, and then I was the founding CEO of a couple. And then second chapter of my career was actually transitioning from startups to later stage companies and moving from kind of a founder, generalist, CEO to actually being kind of more of a product leader. And so I worked at Google, which bought my last startup. And then I went to Credit Karma, as Adriel mentioned, to lead product. And then recently, about a year ago, decided to join Facebook to support the newsfeed, which is the primary product in the Blue app. So I've been doing that for about a year. And as Adriel mentioned, I have this sort of interest in sort of my second career as being mostly around coaching and helping people kind of in career, particularly around transition. And I don't know if there's enough material out there for people that are in that mode of transition. And so that's the reason why I have this newsletter called The Skip. And I started writing it a few months ago and enjoying it. And so I try to keep my balance between my family and, of course, the work at Facebook and the career newsletter. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. And Nikhil, one important clarification. Jess is a recruiter. She finds talent. I get it. What does doing product mean? Are you an engineer? Do you design things? What is the role of somebody in your position?
Yeah, I often ask myself that same question, actually. I think that product is sort of what I call kind of a gap filling function. I think that there are people that sell stuff in organizations, and those are the sort of the sales function of people that build stuff, which we typically call engineering. And then there's people in between. And product usually is the function that is devoted to kind of figuring out what to build and how to connect it to the audience and to ensure that not only the trains are running on time, but that you actually have kind of the right, what I'll call strategy for connecting the business, what's being built, and even just the culture of how the company folds together. So it's this little bit of a tweener function. And in fact, I think that a lot of times product management is super different. If it's an early stage company, you know, like 6 people in a company, to the sort of late stage Google 100,000 person, product changes as a function more profoundly than say sales or engineering, which actually looks quite similar. And that's part of the reason why it's so hard to define product and product management, because it's sort of a chameleon function and a function that's very much dependent on where you are on what I call the innovation curve.
Awesome. So one final note, folks, as we dive into questions. Well, 2 notes, I guess. Remember to ask questions yourself, post them in the chat, send them to me directly. Makes the event go a lot better. And then second of all, we're going to do this Q&A for about 30 to 40 minutes. After that, we're going to break up into networking groups where you guys are going to introduce yourself, the industry you're in, and then share one startup or tech company that you were really impressed by in 2020 or you have high hopes for in 2021. And that'll sort of be, that question will be the crux of our discussion session for our time together in the networking. So let me ask you, Jess, first to define some language for us. Seed, Series A, Series B, Series D, public. What are series and stages of companies? And how do you think about how skill sets need to differ between different stages of companies?
Yeah, it's a great question to kick us off. So in terms of all things in tech, and I think Nikhil's, allusion to, we're still trying to figure out what product managers are as we are leading teams of them. Things in tech tend to be strong ideas loosely held, right? So we're still defining as an industry what is a seed round versus what does a Series B team look like, et cetera. But loosely speaking, to help us anchor on stage and approach, a seed company is as early as they come, right? So a seed stage company can often be as early as an individual founder or a founder and a co-founder and a slide with an idea, right? And a venture capitalist would invest in a company that early and call it a seed stage deal. Pretty easy to remember because it's the seed of an idea, right? That's going to grow into a company over time. Series A, B, C, D happen chronologically over time beyond that, right? So Series A, we've got a little bit more traction. We might not yet be at what's called product market fit, right? Which is a key term in tech, the idea that we're sure that the product has a market and has found its niche inside of that market. But a Series A team might still be before that, but they've got enough traction that they're building a team, they've raised some money, there might be some revenue, probably not profit at that point, right? But some revenue. A Series B, a step above that, right? Slightly bigger team, slightly more revenue, more proof of concept, et cetera. And then once you're getting into Series C, D, and beyond, you're at what's called a growth stage investment from an investor's perspective, right? There's meaningful traction, meaningful revenue, may or may not be profitable, right? That's a lot of the hole that venture capital fills, but you've got a meaningful team and org structure accordingly. And then after those kind of growth stages is when there's an exit, right? So either an acquisition, M&A, or an IPO. So those are kind of the phases of development from a company's perspective. Equally ill-defined, but what we need at those stages, right? I think the later the opportunity, the more opportunity there is for that kind of generalist role, in my experience, right? What you find is early stage teams end up having folks wear many hats, as we like to say, right? So there's opportunity to take on more than the role you signed up for, et cetera. But when you walk in the door as a candidate for an early stage team, it's often because they need a very specific match to what they need filled, right? So in my experience, I have experience marketing to exactly the type of consumer you're looking to engage, right? No one on the team yet has that expertise, so they need it to build. So I think expertise and ownership are the two things that you need most at the earliest stages. The ownership stays, but over time, later stage, you might be able to have a little more wiggle room on whether or not you've had exposure to the industry or the type of work you'll be doing, because there might be mentors around you or a team around you that will help you build on that expertise.
Awesome. So yeah, I want to learn more from you, Nikhil, because you've been through all these stages as an employee and sometimes the CEO of these companies. What are the different soft skills that you think are relevant at different stages? And then how do those hard skills evolve? You can give the example of yourself and product, or you maybe want to talk about a marketing function, a sales function, an engineering function, different things like that. What are the soft skills and hard skills? How do they evolve throughout the different phases of a startup?
Yeah, I mean, a great question. I mean, maybe if I kind of build a little bit off of Jess's sort of structure, I like dividing it into these 4 phases that she alluded to. This sort of seed stage is this early pre-product drunken walk. You're kind of figuring out what's going on. You're throwing more things away than actually sticking. And it's this exercise in trying to experiment as aggressively as you can. It's very, very much wartime. And as a result, because the ground is very unstable, because everything you've built may actually be thrown away the next day, you have to have the soft skills to be able to manage through that type of up and down, that lack of clarity, and the fact that you just don't necessarily have runway. You know, in an early stage company, we have something called the ZCD. ZCD stands for zero cash day. And we actually openly discuss it, which sounds scary, right? It's the day that the company will no longer be able to pay you. So it's very much this internal ability to not get too high, not get too low, and manage through change. When you have something working, you finally have something smoking. And, you know, she described it as sort of this series B-ish stage is generally what we describe as things are starting to work. And when you have things smoking, the last thing you want to do is try some major new thing that extinguishes that smoke. And so you really want smoke to turn into fire. And so stability is the name of the game. And so now the hard skills come in, which is, well, we've never really built a sales force. We've never really had a customer service function. How do you think about HR? Or admin was doing that before, and we actually now need to offer healthcare, or whatever the actual foundational pieces are. So the company is actually moving to a place where it's taking fewer risks and actually creating peace as much as possible. Most companies try to stay there as long as possible, but there's a small set that go through these later stages. These Series D, Series E companies are companies that maybe 20 years ago would have gone public. But now, because capital is easy to raise, they go through these crazy growth curves. And she referenced things like DoorDash and Uber and Snowflake. These are companies that just exploded. And if you're lucky enough to find yourself in hypergrowth companies, they literally are growing so fast that they need to hire in these extreme ways, because the company itself is got a product that they can't even keep up with demand, right? It's a fairly interesting time for a company. And it's, again, wartime. And it's chaos where your manager may have been in the company for only a year and they've gotten 3 different managers because everything's growing so fast. And I experienced that at Credit Karma when we joined. We went from kind of 40 million to 100 million users in a 2-year period of time. So you see these hypergrowth kind of settings that take place. And there again, you need to be able to sort of really internalize from a soft skills point of view, what got you here isn't what gets you there. Because what got you here is protecting smoke into fire. And now you want to create a new product. You want to light things, as aggressively as you can to kind of take advantage. You want to go global. Those kinds of motions are very different than what you had in the earlier stages. And then when you get to scale, when you're a market leader, that at that point, you move back into peace. That's what I'm experiencing now at Facebook, where we're as much as possible trying to have predictable futures, public, but we also are very thoughtful on these sort of 5-year plans. How do we think through, predictability and sustainability? And so again, you kind of move back. And so I think the soft skills are most critical at that first and third phase when there's so much change. And I think the hard skills tend to come in most critically in the second and fourth stages when you can actually be much more of a specialist.
So I want to talk about making that transition from a larger company, that more stable company, into this environment. Nikhil, you're now at Facebook. Pays probably pretty well, pretty stable. You know, not every day is a 9 to 5, but if that's what you need, you can probably find a position like that. What you described in startup sounds like hell. It sounds exhausting. It sounds tiring. It sounds, let me give it to you firsthand, it is rough. And the equity is certainly a part of it, but it's really just paper money until anything happens. What are the questions that you would recommend people ask themselves as they think, is that earlier stage startup right for me? Right? There's a lot of people on this call here who have come from places like agencies, which is definitely tough work, but different growth trajectory, places like public companies, which is certainly tough work, but less madness and more of that, how do you build that predictability? What questions would you recommend somebody you're coaching ask themselves before they say, yep, I guess I'm going to be a Series B guy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And there is no perfect answer here, but I think that for me, I'm always reverse engineering outcomes. And so what I'm always trying to understand is, so I've made this successful transition. What did I have to believe to actually make happen? And so in this example, if you asked me, like, if you were looking for, if you were job seeking and you're trying to figure out phase, like, is it better to go late? Is it better to go early? What do I have to believe in order for me to have early? I ask myself, how much risk does someone have to take on me for me to be a candidate for that particular job? So if it turns out that I've had a bunch of domain expertise, referring back to what Jess said, which is, hey, I may be a specialist, I'm particularly good in a certain area. The risk that someone would take is that if that area is something that's not recruited or well understood, that's a fairly dramatic risk. So let's say you're a very specific specialist in a product marketing area, just as an example. You go to an early stage company, they don't even have a product marketing function. It's a pretty big gap. So what I would say is that the idea of you going in and saying that you should care about this function, you should then care about me as a specialist as part of that function, and then you should see me as qualifying for the role. It's 3 jumps. It's a hard jump to make. On the other hand, if you said, well, I've actually a very strong, say, in tech, software engineer, let's take the most extreme case. Well, some companies need to take, need software engineers like they need air oxygen. So the idea that you would be interested and open to that would be very, very, powerful. But if you said that, well, I need to do software engineering, but the expertise I have is fairly, distinct from how people code today. I've worked in tools and I've programmed in ways that aren't really contemporary. They're not the way that people program now. Well, then in that case, a startup is taking less of a risk on your function and more of a risk on you and your skill set. So then what I would do is say, well, startups are great, but I want to basically work for a startup that really is looking for exactly my background. So generally, my kind of short answer, and I'm happy to expound on it, but my short answer is look to see from the employer's perspective, what kind of gap or risk do they have to make? How many leaps do they have to take to find a connection? And then when you look at it from that angle, then I'm a huge fan of only making a single jump if possible. And what's nice about tech is you could land into a company which may not have the most exciting role or maybe not the most exciting company, but then you can make a second jump because these are not like 10, 12 year tenures. Average tech tenure is 2 years, 10 months, which is a shocking number. Most people don't think of that way. 2 years, 10 months in tech is normal. So the fact that you may land, find yourself comforted in tech, maybe the company's not the best, but maybe make a second transition. And that second job, that skip job is actually the one you're optimizing for, is actually a very thoughtful way of thinking about it. But it all is about reverse engineering risk on you.
I think that's a great point. Figuring out where you fit in, what's going to be that easiest path with the fewest number of dominoes you got to knock down is really valuable. Jess, I want your thought on that. If you are hiring for a position and say it's a earlier stage company, say Series C and earlier, and you're speaking with somebody who's super competent, has the right skill set, but comes from a public company, for example, or an agency that's not a high growth tech company, but more of an agency world. What would be your recommendation? How do you try to suss out if they've got the right skills? So let me ask that from your perspective. And then take the flip side of that. If you were coaching somebody for an interview like that, how should they be telling their stories and coming prepared? So two-part question. One is, how do you suss out if they've got the right skills, if they've never done this specific kind of role before or at this kind of company? And then how do you recommend people begin to tell those stories?
Yeah, love that you asked those questions in tandem, because I actually think storytelling is the name of the game if you're a candidate in one of these positions and looking for something specific. You know, I think there's a way to tell pretty quickly as a recruiter if the candidate you're talking to is kind of in spray and pray mode, right? Where they're sending resumes out into the world and just hoping for a broad transition or a job anywhere, right? Which is, in this environment, it happens. Or if they're really deliberately interested in a team at your stage and your scale. And I think a lot of what makes a candidate compelling in the early stages is that kind of, are they showing conviction around our story, around our team? What makes them convinced that we're the right place for them? Because so much of what Nicole said, right, in these kind of wartime environments, a lot of what happens is ownership, right? People lean into their roles. They take on more than they originally signed up for, right? And having faith that they're going to do that starts with having faith that they have conviction and skin in the game around the problem you're solving, right? So doing your homework around, what is the problem this team is solving? If I'm applying to a specific function, have I checked on LinkedIn to see who already exists in that function and how my skill set can complement theirs, right? How can my skills complement the stories that they're trying to tell internally, whether that be because of my function and where I'd align there, whether that be because of a personal experience that I had and how I can lace that kind of into my story and why I have conviction around what they're building. And I think getting really tactical, right, as you're talking to interviewers. I think there's a lot of temptation in all industries, but in tech especially, right, to blow smoke with words like strategic or, you know, fill in the blank here, right? And what ends up happening to recruiters on my side of the table is we walk away from these conversations and we have to go to a hiring manager. And there's this question of like, that guy seemed great, but what did he actually do, right? Like, how did she actually contribute? And I think even inside of a huge company, right? Like I was at Capital One, there's a way to tell a story of like, yeah, this was a huge team, but like as my specific role, here's very deliberately how I contributed, right? And the temptation can be to make yourself sound big and flashy and make your role sound strategic or like you had ownership or oversight over way more than it might have been. And I think the inverse actually proves more at an earlier stage, right? Get really granular, get specific. How can the specific problems you solved or the actions you took translate into the needs of the company you're interviewing with? And that can make for a much more meaningful impression.
Yeah. One more time, folks, post questions in the chat as you got them. Thank you for those who have. I want to understand your role a little more, Jess. So you are not a recruiter for a company, you're a recruiter for a venture capital firm, which means you represent a lot of different companies. How do you work? Like what is our company's coming to you and saying, hey, I've got these 5 positions, go figure it out. Is it every single position you hire for? Don't they have their own internal recruiters? How do you work? Because one of the big things that we talk a lot about in just traditional sort of job search hacks and tips is go connect with recruiters on LinkedIn so that they can know you exist, because they're the ones who know about the jobs, sometimes even before hiring managers. If people are connecting with you, what's the best way to do that? What is it you do, I suppose, and who do you represent?
It's a fair question. So I'll take half a step back and explain a little bit more about the industry more broadly first before I jump into what I do specifically at Code2. But I think one thing to be aware of in terms of why my function even exists, which is helpful to understand why we work the way we work, is that the pendulum swings, right, in terms of, is there more capital or are there more entrepreneurs available? Pretty simple supply and demand, right? Are companies trying to get venture capital harder than venture capitalists are trying to get into companies, right? And what happened, there was a period of time, call it 10 years ago, where venture capital actually became a much more competitive industry in terms of being a venture capitalist was a lot more competitive, right? Once one VC wants in on a deal, there's a bunch of VCs scrambling after him or her to get in on the same deal. And so what venture capital firms and other investment firms started doing is they started investing in ways to differentiate themselves, right? Like just like a company wants to differentiate themselves so that you will become a customer, we did the same thing. And one of the ways they differentiated was by building talent functions. So you will see this more and more often across venture capital firms. There's what's called portfolio support services, right? Where it's my job, I actually don't do any HR or recruiting for the actual fund that I work for. I work exclusively for the founders and the entrepreneurs that we invest in, right? So after the investment, they'll come to me, explain to me their team dynamic, what they're looking for, how they think they're hiring, and I work to support them rather than to support our own internal initiatives, right? So that's an important dynamic to understand. Like we exist inside of the venture capital firm, but for the benefit of the founders and the entrepreneurs. So I think a really good way to start to understand if and how it makes sense for you to approach someone in a seat like mine is to understand what the actual VC fund that they invest in is focused on. So if you're looking for a job at a CPG company, right, there's an investment firm that will focus exclusively on CPG, direct to consumer investments that are up and coming startups, where that person might have line of sight into 100 companies, call it, that are working on the problems you're looking to get involved in and that you want to solve in your next job, right? So getting savvy on the fund first will almost help you understand whether or not it's even worth your time, right, to reach out to the recruiter in question. Once you understand whether the fund is interesting to you, there's ways to understand, hey, do they have an operations-focused recruiter internally? Do they have someone focused on career transition? What can I read about the way that that recruiter works, right? And I think something to remember, honestly, is that like you're helping us, right? Like it is our job to find great talent. And so don't feel like you're bothering someone or like you're taking their time. It is literally our job to place great talent into these portfolio companies, and you make us look good, right? When you're wonderful and we get to place you. And so I think being deliberate about who you're approaching so that you're making the best use of your own time, but not being shy, right? Like I will share that I got my first job in Silicon Valley by responding to a tweet, right? So anything is possible. And I think the worst thing that happens is that someone doesn't get back to you. And this is a really generous industry, right? People are happy to share their time, answer questions, et cetera, as a general rule. And so when your worst case scenario is a non-answer, it's worth the risk, in my opinion.
Awesome, thank you. I want to give the next question to Danielle. She actually has 2 questions, and I'm going to latch on to her second question a little bit because I think it's super important. It's one that I had as well.
All right, first question. I'm sure it's not a very easy answer for either of you, but I'm in transition. I'm in marketing. I've worked at a startup before, but at what stage do either of you, I don't know if you know this, do most startups start needing marketing roles? Would it be, really early on, or is it as they get later on, like a series B or C or something like that? I don't know if that's a very straight answer. Probably depends on company, but I was just kind of curious if there's an average, I guess, of when a company would start needing a marketing type role.
Yeah, it's a good question. The answer in my experience, especially with the market the way it is today, is earlier and earlier, right? Marketing used to be something that word of mouth would handle, or the CEO would handle, or someone more generally would handle. I think in my experience, teams are looking for expertise more recently than they were in the past, largely because there's lots of people with the same idea running around in this market, right? And the question pretty quickly becomes execution and storytelling, right? And that's pretty crucial. I think one interesting way to get back into startups, if you're thinking about transitioning, and this is, I saw you already added me on LinkedIn, so this is a conversation we can have offline also, right? Is some teams, there's a pull, right, between how many resources they have available, money for payroll.
It's your account manager?
Sorry?
I'm sorry? Servian wants to talk to me tomorrow.
Oh, I'm going to mute her. I think that was not for us.
Okay. So, right, you're experiencing this pull between what they really need in terms of internal help, resources, et cetera, and the resources, quite frankly, they have to spend on it or what they can commit. And so one thing I'm seeing, especially in marketing, if you're looking at that function, is a lot of consulting opportunities, right? So defining your niche, what concrete finite project can I help a team with that is mutually beneficial, right? You'll make some money, you'll have the job, you'll get, some portfolio stuff happening and rolling, but also for your sake, right? Before you're signing up to join a team full time, how cool to be able to see under the hood and understand what it is they're working on. So opening yourself up to kind of a diversity of roles in your search, I think could be pretty compelling.
Great.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of folks they start their own businesses while they're unemployed and say, hey, I'm a consultant that does this. And they go do it. Sometimes there's money in it, which is ideal, but sometimes it's experience, networking, portfolio management, hard skills. So if you can do all those things, no matter what, if you're a salesperson, find some startups to help out in sale. Everybody wants help there. If you're a marketer, you can do the same thing. Come with a few ideas and say, hey, startup X, I want to do this, that, and the other thing for you because I see you're not doing that well enough. Will you let me do that? Amazing way to both build your network, build that credibility, things like that. Danielle, ask that second question because I think it was an awesome one.
Sure. So what are some ways that a candidate can research a company, especially when it's early in the stage, like very early on, because, there's going to be risk even for a candidate because let's just say the company ends up doing poorly and doesn't do well, and then they end up being laid off again or whatever the situation may be. Granted, that's a risk no matter what job you take, but are there resources out there, especially if a company isn't really a company yet, if that makes any sense? So they may not even have a website yet, or, how do you really find more information on a startup? Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm going to take the first stab at that, and then I want to give it to you, Nikhil. So first of all, being at the earliest stages sounds really sexy when you hear about how it went 10 years later, but it's a tough haul. Being employees 1 through 10, 1 through 5 especially, more times than not, is not going to be a glamorous position. That said, I think one of the best things to do is as you define sort of, I want this many people or this kind of function, go on crunchbase.com, find companies that within the last 3 months raised money, and they're always being announced, because those people are hiring a ton, because that's what they raised the money for. It's in order to hire, and many times actually you're in marketing in order to grow that function. So going to Crunchbase, seeing who raised money within your field or within your industry or things like that within the last 3 months is a great way to find those companies. But Nikhil, tell me more about vetting those companies. If I find a company that raised $1 quadrillion last month and I'm like, great, they're probably hiring, what do I do next to make sure they're not going to go out of business? They're not going to go all Theranos or Nikola or whatever on me and throw me under the bus.
Well, I mean, definitely fundraising, is a nice filtering. And, there's a lot more transparency to getting information than there ever has been. As Adriel mentioned, Crunchbase is great, or funding announcements are great. Oftentimes funding announcements are delayed or sometimes even kept quiet. But for the most part, those things come out. I mean, I would say to you that, there's a couple of sort of adjacent notes that I would make. I mean, I think that the challenge is that, when I started a company, I needed help, but the moment I fundraised, the polarity shifted, and now I got a lot more inbound for exactly the reasons we just mentioned. Once you fundraise, people know of you and they see you as a reduced risk, which means that I can get a lot more choosy a lot faster. And so the kinds of risk I was willing to take before I fundraised was dramatically different than the kind of risk I would take after I fundraised. So going back to my original rubric, if you are the type of person who has choice, then I think that your question is really how do I make sure that I'm picking something that's going to stay healthy? And in that case, you kind of are looking at the size and magnitude and quality of the investors who effectively are saying that, well, the higher quality investors, the brand names, if you will, the ones that put more money to work, they have choice too. And so just like any branding notion, they would definitely select the better companies. But if you're the type of person who may be breaking into tech for the first time, or may have broad skills, but not necessarily, unique skills, like in your case, maybe you've done corporate marketing, but not necessarily performance marketing. And a company needs performance marketing, which is a very, very specific skill, very data oriented. and you're like, well, I'm not necessarily the expert there, but I've done a little bit of that for 6 months in my previous job. You going after a company that has raised a big round is going to make it hard to distinguish yourself and storytell your experience. But on the other hand, if you were to say, well, I care about this product or I have this functional expertise, I really am actually looking for the Crunchbase companies that are much closer, that are much smaller, and I'm willing to consult, to use the note that was made before, or work for free, because I get a lot out of it. I get brand, I get experience, and I just don't think it matters that much if companies fold. I actually think that if your average is 2 years, 10 months, and if a company folded and you got experience, that's actually fine. In the United States, working for a startup that failed is like a rite of passage. It's like you've achieved something. It's the strangest, oddest way of thinking. While in other countries, the idea that, let's say in Japan, where people do take much longer tenures, the idea that you chose a company that failed must reflect poorly on you and your skills. But I think 99% of people, they interview someone who's gone through a tough, rough experience, they have a lot more interesting things to say about what they learned. And so I actually think that one should not head that direction. And then the last point I'd make, and I know it's a little tangential, but I think it's important, is I think that there's this myth that exists in the Valley, which is if you go to later stage companies, that it actually is a much more regular, much more 9-to-5 job. And that in the early stages, you kind of work 24/7. I would say that that is actually the opposite of my experience. And for the following reasons, late stage companies have a whole ton of people that work there. And those tons of people want to know what you're doing. And they have a lot of things to say about what you're doing. So the vast majority of people that work in larger companies spend all their day in meetings. And there are lots of meetings they don't even get to. And when you have a large company that has an international presence, you travel because you have to, because your teams are split and you're remote, and travel is really impactful on family and on boundaries and on time. When you're in a small company, everyone that works there can sit around one table and you don't have a lot of meetings to take, and you have lots of ability to set boundaries. And I think that that's actually one of the reasons why I like early stage, because it's a lot more shapeable in terms of personal characteristics, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the same financial outcomes, the branding outcomes, as was mentioned.
Awesome. So I want to ask one additional thing. Actually, you were talking about top tier VCs. I think one great strategy, every VC announces their funding, or announces it basically as early as they're allowed to announce it. So one thing you can do, even if you don't know who top tier VCs are, Google it, find top 10 Silicon Valley investors, go on their Twitter profiles. They're going to announce when they do an investment. Look through who they just announced over the last month or two. Those are companies that have a great chance of making it to the next round because they were backed by somebody very legit, and they just raised money, probably a fat chunk of it. So they have an opportunity for you as an employee there. So one great way to just source out who are those people from top tier VCs is go to top tier VCs, see who they just recently tweeted about, because that's usually a good sign.
I will add to that, Adriel, tactically speaking, once you find out the company, I think a good way to actually get in and find out about them very, very tactically is to not anchor on the top of the house necessarily, right? Like that top tier VC, that CEO, et cetera, they're getting a ton of inbound. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of people protecting their time, right? They might have an executive assistant in their email inbox, so they're not even seeing your email, right? And so what I would do is I wouldn't be shy on leaning into the more junior people in that organization and cold inbounding those folks, right? Because a lot of times they have bandwidth, they have energy, they're enthusiastic. They might even have a recruiting bonus tied to bringing people in. So they are quite literally incentivized to bring in great talent. And they have the time, right, to reach out to you, to talk back. And I know I keep emphasizing this, but Silicon Valley and tech in general is a pretty generous industry. And so I think getting creative about who you're reaching out to and not only anchoring on the top will really help you get an in.
Love that. That's where informational interviews come in. And these people are also super proud, right? Their company just raised 10 or 50 or $100 million. They want to take all the credit and tell you about how wonderful it is to be there. They are gushing with information and really want to share it. I'm going to ask both of you, Mikkel and Jess, one final question, and then we're going to go to networking, where we're going to break up into groups, and you guys are going to share your answer to a very similar question. So the question for both of you is, what do you see, where's the frothiness in a good way? Where's the opportunity for tech and startups over the next 12 months? What kinds of companies are going to be hiring a lot? If you want to name some names that you love to watch, that would be awesome. And what about over the 5 years? What are the trends, the things that big technology companies are going to be working on and big investors are going to be pouring money into, where you could really build a career for yourself over the next 5 to 10 years? We'll start with Nikhil, and then we'll go to Jess. And then so you guys can think about it too. Again, remember, think of one startup that you, or tech companies you've been watching in 2020, or you want to watch in 2021, and that'll be the crux of our networking group.
Yeah, but I always tend to shape answers in terms of phase of company. And so I think that what I feel like is the sunshine tends to fall on one or maybe two phases of company on every few years, and it shifts. And I think that going into 2020, this time last year, I thought that there was a dramatic shift taking place where late stage big tech was going to have its moment and growth companies were going to struggle. And so growth companies had largely kind of gotten out the door. So Slack and Pinterest and the Credit Karmas and other had basically all kind of played it out. The next wave were 3 to 5 years. I thought big tech was going to be the year. Last year was going to be the big year for big tech. Turns out that as soon as COVID hit, everything changed. And I think growth companies really had their moment. And so you just saw Affirm went out last month, and you saw Zoom and the amazing work that took place. And my general feeling is this year will continue to be the year of these hyper growth companies, these so-called unicorns that are, worth $1 billion, in January and worth $4 billion in September. These growth companies are going to fuel the sucking sound of recruiting all across the valley. I think we are seeing considerable slowdown in late stage. So the Netflix and the Googles and the Facebooks and others are actually continuing to hire, but not at the type of percentage growth that they had experienced 3 to 5 years ago. And I think that there is severe concern around regulation coming in from the government, as well as the sort of growth and earnings are starting to slow a bit, and they're in this digestion of resource mode. And so if I was to pick the phase of company that I'm most excited about, I think they are probably these growth phase companies, at least in the next 1 to 2 years. When I look about 5 years and I think about industry, I think that, my notion is similar to kind of the observation I made 3 to 4 years ago. If you look at tech and you look at where tech has had the greatest impact, there are 3 industries that kind of have remained untouched. One is finance, one is healthcare, and one is education. There's 2 common threads as to why those 3 industries have not changed as much. And this is a statement that was made maybe 3 or 4 years ago. One is regulation. Those 3 are heavily based on compliance and government change. And a lot of it has to do with just the cost of acquiring a customer. Mm-hmm. Thinking about acquiring a student or getting a healthcare patient or getting someone to actually part with their money and trust you, that's a big ask versus, say, a communications product, which is inherently social. It costs micro pennies for me to acquire a customer for a next communication app. It costs hundreds of dollars to acquire a customer as a bank. And that's the reason why those industries are moving much slower. That's the reason why communications and commerce has changed so much. Well, in the last 5 years, we saw a massive impact to finance. It's part of the reason I joined Credit Karma 5 years ago, is that I thought that finance was going to have its day as banks were really struggling to sort of change. And I think the fintech industry really changed it. And healthcare and education remained the 2 that had not changed until COVID. And so if you look at the changes in, say, vaccines, the changes in how people are managing healthcare, the global sort of investment around healthcare, and then you look at how our kids have changed in terms of how they're being educated with online, those 2 industries are the ripest for change. So if I personally was looking for growth and looking for disruption, I would have targeted healthcare and education, simply because tech has really not changed them. They have not changed as a result over decades, and they had their moment in terms of disruption.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with healthcare and education more strongly. Those are incredible industries that are really going to be, a lot of money is going to pour into it over the next 5 years. Jess, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, there's totally, I agree, there are those extrinsic factors, right? What is the industry doing? Where hasn't been disrupted yet? I think I'll flip the lens a little bit and say, take some time to think about your intrinsic motivations, right? As you think about the problems you're going to solve, like I think we've made this clear, working at a startup isn't necessarily easy, right? And so if you're going to be dedicating your time and your energy and taking equity in a company, right? Let's think about the problems you need solved in your day-to-day life. And there's probably a lot of folks out there like you, and there's probably someone building something to try to address that market, right? So start with your own intrinsic motivations. And as you think about finance, for example, right? Hey, I have a teenager. I'm having a really hard time figuring out how to teach my teenager financial literacy, right? There's actually a company out there called Step that is creating a banking platform for teenagers to help them learn financial literacy. A plug, it's a Coatue portfolio company. Hey, I'm working remotely, right, for the first time. And I'm having a really hard time explaining to people that can't meet with me at the same time as I need a meeting how to run a specific program or give a specific presentation. There's a tool for that, right? There's a company called Loom that is building what's called an asynchronous communication platform where you can make presentations for big company board meetings. My mom's a preschool teacher and she uses it to read books to her kids while they're virtual, right? So think about problems that you're having in your day-to-day life, whether it's because you're running a small business and you're struggling to keep up with your books, right? Or because you're a parent or going through a particular life phase. And I think starting intrinsically is just as valuable in understanding like, what are the problems I really care to dig in on and where I could tell a compelling story as a candidate for what I'm interested in doing next.
I think that's very well said, because again, like we talk about all the time, you've got to be the differentiated one. You've got to be the one that cares the most. You've got to be the one that's thought through this the most, and that's how you do it. Jess and Nikhil, let's all give you guys a big round of applause. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. Let's give a second round of applause to the rest of y'all for hanging out with us, because otherwise it would just be me, Jess, and Nikhil, and I don't think they like me that much, so there'd be no need for that. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate the love in the Zoom chat. So here's what we're going to do now. We're going to break up into 3 groups. Nikhil's going to be in one. Jess is going to be another. I'm going to be in the third. We are going to stay on for 15 minutes, so a little past the hour. If you've got to hop off exactly on the hour, I know Nikhil does, totally fine. And you guys will also receive an email in a few hours with contact information, with where to follow Nikhil and Jess, and reach out with more questions and things like that. So I'm going to open up these groups in a moment here. Let's bring you over here. Beautiful. All right, the rooms are open, and I'll see you back here in 15 minutes.